Hello, and welcome to our audience from around the world, and welcome to this latest in our series of COP conversations ahead of the COP climate change meeting in Glasgow, Scotland, United Kingdom, just coming up in a few weeks' time. My name is Rana Mitter. I teach Chinese politics and history here at Oxford. My role today is to introduce our very expert and very engaging speaker, and he is Professor Sam Fankhauser. Now, Sam's talk today is titled Why Net Zero, brackets, and what is it? Both very good questions. Net zero refers to a state in which the greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere are balanced by removal out of the atmosphere. And the term is important because, at least for carbon dioxide, this is the state at which global warming stops. And the implication is that climate damage will continue to escalate as long as emissions continue because of global heating, which of course is proportionate to CO2 emissions. But all is not necessarily lost, because Oxford has several researchers working in this area. And one of the key voices today is Sam, our speaker today. Just a brief introduction to him. He's Professor of Climate Change, Economics and Policy at the Smith School of Enterprise and Research Director of Oxford Net Zero. His research focuses on policy interventions and governance arrangements needed for that net zero transition. And he was also an inaugural member of the UK's Climate Change Committee, the Subcommittee on Adaptation, and he's written a number of books on the subject, including Sustainability Economics and the Economics of Climate Resilience and Adaptation. Now, as I'm sure those of you who've been with us before will know, Sam will speak for about 15 minutes. We'll then have about 15 minutes after that for Q&A. So depending on which platform you're on, please do send in questions through the comments section of Twitter or Facebook or the chat window on YouTube, and I will do my best to pass them on. We're all still working off different Wi-Fi setups, so if there's a sudden glitch, just bear with us and we'll try and get it back as soon as possible. But I think we are almost certain to have a very smooth and very engaging conversation. Sam, welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Rana, and you've kind of answered the question already, but let me elaborate on it anyway. So why net zero, and what do we mean when we say net zero emissions? For a lot of people, saying net zero emissions is a sort of a shorthand for saying, I'm committed to the Paris Agreement on climate change. I have signed up to the Paris objective, which is to limit the global mean temperature increases somewhere in the range of 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial level. So net zero, in a sense, is the shorthand for saying, yes, I agree with the Paris commitment. But underneath, obviously, that shorthand is a piece of science. And that piece of science is that for any global temperature objective, whether it's 1.5, 2 degrees or any other temperature level, there's a finite carbon budget that is associated with that temperature level. And that's because carbon is a very long-lived gas. Once it's in the atmosphere, it stays there for a long time. So once that carbon budget is reached, if you want to stabilize temperature, any emissions from then on, there has to be a balance between those emissions and the removal of those emissions from the atmosphere into sink. You can think of it a little bit like a bathtub, if you will. The water pours into the bathtub, and once you reach the water level you're comfortable with, you need that balance between water flowing into the bathtub and water flowing out of the bathtub. So the atmosphere is more complicated than that, but that's quite a useful, simple way of thinking what we do. So net zero is about reaching that comfortable level of temperature that we've agreed on, and then stabilizing temperatures or emissions at that level. And the carbon budget that is associated with the Paris 1.5 to 2 degrees is something like 400 to 700 gigatons of carbon. That's about 10, maybe 20 years worth of emissions. And the question then is, how do we allocate those emissions over time? And the answer in most of the scenarios, in most of the sort of the planning tools that we apply to that looks a little bit like the chart here on the right of the screen, which is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has run literally hundreds of simulations of how one might reach or might sort of obey the Paris objectives. And those charts, those pathways look like the one we're looking at, emissions have to be cut something like half in the next 10 years. And then they have to gradually reach net zero, so that balance between emissions and removal by the middle of the century. And if we do that, we stay within the carbon budget that hopefully gives us 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming maximum. So that's, in a sense, the science behind net zero, but also the politics, because the Paris Agreement obviously is an international agreement where all countries in the world have signed up to. So that's one way of looking at it. Let me give you a slightly different picture to tell the same story, the story of net zero in terms of flows of carbon, flows of emissions between different spheres of the Earth. There's the atmosphere where carbon accumulates, but there's also the biosphere, the land and the oceans, where some of that carbon gets deposited. And then there's the lithosphere, which is the Earth's crust, where fossil fuels are currently located, where our coal and our oil and our gas is located. And the current situation, which you look at here, is an imbalance. There's a lot of carbon that flows from the lithosphere, from the coal and gas reserves underground into the atmosphere. Some of that carbon disappears from the atmosphere into the biospheres. Mostly it gets absorbed by the oceans. But then there's also the counterflow of emissions that come from deforestations and other sources, which means there's a sort of a net carbon flow into the atmosphere. And that is what gives us global warming. What we have to achieve is to have a balance between those flows from those various spheres. So we need the balance of inflows and outflows, emissions and removals into the atmosphere. But we probably also want the balance of inflows and outflows between the lithosphere and the biosphere. You could sort of keep carbon stable in the atmosphere, but move coal reserves and have that carbon absorbed by trees. But as Miles Allen would say, there's a limit to which you can turn rocks into trees. So you want the balance between all those three spheres, as the arrows that we're looking at here suggest. Now, how do you do that? Step number one is to deal with the emissions into the atmosphere, because that's where the imbalance currently is. And that's the story of reducing emissions from land use, but in particular, reducing emissions from fossil fuels and industrial processes. That is the main thing we have to do to reach net zero, and the thing we have to do very, very urgently if you want to stay on that emissions path that I've shown, if you want to reduce global emissions by half within the next 10 years. So next question then is, how are we doing on reducing those emissions? It's a race. How are we featuring in that race, the race to net zero? And the answer is, it depends which emission source we are talking about, which sector we are talking about. In the electric power sector, the generation of electricity, we are doing reasonably well. We are nowhere near where we have to be, but important tipping points have been reached. Renewable energy, clean energy is now increasingly competitive. It's now as cheap as fossil fuel energy. Certainly if you factor in some of the sort of environmental side benefit like air pollution, or environmental costs like air pollution, electric power can now be made clean through renewable electricity. So we have to invest a lot more into renewables, but technology-wise, the technology is now there. The reason why we have to invest a lot more in clean electricity into renewables is partly to replace the current fossil fuel electricity, but it's also we have to increase the supply of clean electricity, because we will then use that clean electricity to clean up some of the other emission sources, some of the other sectors that emit CO2. So as for transport, car emissions is probably the next runner in the race. Electric vehicles are now very, very common. They're getting better, they're getting cheaper, batteries are lasting longer, they're getting lighter. So we haven't reached the tipping point yet, but we're getting closer. The UK government has just announced, for example, that it will try to phase out new internal combustion engine cars within 10 years. So within 10 years, all new cars sold in the UK will be electric. And obviously that electricity has to be clean. So cleaning up the power sector before is a good idea. The other runners in the race are further behind than those two. Building emissions and industry emissions. We have some of the technologies that we will need. Some clean technologies are emerging. In the case of buildings, again, we will need clean electricity to move away from gas boilers to heat our homes to things like heat pumps. That technology exists. It works in Scandinavia, in Switzerland, where I'm from. Heat pumps are common. In the UK and other parts of the world, there's still some behavioral resistance, but also the sort of the skill mix of installing those technologies and retrofitting them into existing buildings. Industry, again, the technologies are starting to emerge. They're pioneering attempts to have carbon-free steel, for example, but a lot more needs to be done. Hydrogen will probably play a role to replace coal as the heating source of choice. But that runner, again, is even further behind than the buildings runner. Behind that, we have aviation, we have agriculture. And those are areas where really a lot more innovation will be needed, a lot more thinking will have to go into the solution. Why this is happening, why this sort of innovation is being explored, behavioral change will be important. We will probably have to change our eating habits, less red meat, more vegetarian diets. Our flying habits will have to be explored post-COVID. That may no longer be such a big deal. So that, in a nutshell, is the race to net zero. How can we reduce our emissions as quickly as possible? And it is a race, and some sectors are better placed than others. What that chart also tells you is that there will be residual emissions. Some of those sectors will probably be too slow. There will be emissions that remain by the middle of the century when we want to be at net zero. And that means we have to start looking at the net, the removal of emissions from the atmosphere, about the net in net zero. And that brings us back to the chart we had a minute ago, and the second set of arrows, the ones that sort of point in the other direction, as it were, that move carbon from the atmosphere, either into the lithosphere or into the biosphere. There are options there. Some of them are very well known and have been with us forever. In particular, this one here, forest management. Forests are an amazing sink of carbon emissions. And if we look after our forests well, increase our forest cover, that can be an important contribution to removing carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, it's important to say that that doesn't necessarily mean that we are sort of optimizing our forests for carbon absorption. That would mean probably planting fast-growing trees, often sort of exotic species that absorb carbon very fast. That's not what we're talking about, because those plantations would probably cause other environmental problems. They may not be sustainable. They may be susceptible to pests. What we're talking about is increasing the native species, the existing forests, managing them better and increasing their cover. So that is step one in the removal of emissions, a technology that we're very used to. Another technology, which is leaving the drawing board at the moment, would be to use some of that forest coverage, harvest it sustainably, and the word sustainable harvesting is important here. Use some of that biomass for power generation, for example, or other energy generation sources, and capture the CO2 before it reaches the atmosphere, capture it and put it underground. So moving the carbon, as it were, from the biosphere back into the lithosphere, so the trees become rocks again. They're pioneering installations that are trying to do that. It's known as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. This is something that is starting to happen, but a long way to go still. Then the final arrow there, from the atmosphere into the lithosphere, that is known as direct air capture. That is still on the drawing board, but pilot installations exist. There's one in Iceland, for example. And basically that means sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. It's harder than one might think, because carbon is a trace gas. There's only 0.04% of the atmosphere is carbon. So it's sort of a bit like sort of searching for needles in a haystack. But direct air capture is now also being explored and is being ramped up, and hopefully will become part of the solution for net zero. So that's roughly the sort of technological and behavioral challenges that we have. In parallel of bringing down our emissions in line with the Paris requirements that I have reproduced here on the right-hand side again, obviously the world will change, and we have to reduce our emissions in the context of a changing world. And some of those changes are both scary in terms of carbon, but also opportunities in terms of carbon. People predict, for example, that the infrastructure stock in the world will double over the next 15 years or so. So all the power stations, the ports, the roads, the water systems that we have, we will build the same stuff again over the next 15 years. GDP probably doubles in 20 years under reasonable sort of growth assumptions. Again, this means everything we now produce and consume, all the cars, the cement, the haircuts, the holidays, the bank accounts, all that we will produce and consume again within 20 years. Urban population will double in slightly more than that, maybe 40 years, and those people will have to live somewhere. So we have to rebuild our cities, all the Shanghais, the Mexico cities, the Londons. We have to build those cities once again. So that's a huge amount of change. And if we do that wrong, then it will lock in a lot of emissions. It will lock in a lot of carbon. But if we do it right, we have that opportunity over those 15 to 40 years. If we do it right, we can also change our path to a genuine net zero path in terms of infrastructure, GDP, and urban development. So that's the challenge. Fortunately, people are waking up to that challenge. You all know about the school strikes and what civil society is doing, but that's only one part, and a very, very important part, but only one part of how society, how we all now are responding to the climate crisis and to the climate challenge. Business and the financial sector are taking note, local communities are taking note, the courts are taking note. There's increasing number of court cases on climate change. So given that we have that drive now, the challenge on the left-hand side is still what it is, but the right-hand side of this chart makes me actually optimistic that we can just about reach net zero by the middle of the century. Let me stop here. Let me open it up for questions.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. As I was saying beforehand, both erudite and engaging, and we were not disappointed in the least in either aspect. And the proof of that is the fact that the questions have been pouring in through the various channels. So I'm going to get to some of them straight away. They're very much questions that I want to ask too, but I'm going to ask them through the voice of our attendees from, as ever, from around the world. And we know that from past experience, actually, these conversations, we have several tens of thousands of people who are either watching live or watching back. You mentioned courts, business, finance, a whole variety of civil society actors, you might say, in the last part of your comment, Sam. And let me use that to link to a question that's come in from Richard L. It's a quite pointed question. He says, a lot of companies are saying that they are net zero. Is there an easy way to tell the real pledges from the fake ones? And I think beyond that, actually rather cleverly pointed question from Richard, I might expand it slightly to say, are there particular things that we as consumers should be watching out for in a broader sense when we make judgments about corporate actors and their commitment or otherwise to net zero?
It's a very good question. The first thing I would say is that those net zero pledges, we should welcome them. It is a recognition that business is part of the solution, is part of the problem, but can also be part of the solution. So those net zero pledges are important. They're a signal that business is starting to understand what needs to be done. But the question is absolutely right. Not all of those net zero pledges are genuine, deep net zero pledges that are consistent with that Paris path that I've shown you. How do you find out what's good and what isn't? One test is to actually ask, to what extent do firms with net zero pledges reduce their own emissions, the emissions in their own factories and the emissions in their own supply chain? To what extent do they reduce emissions as opposed to relying on offsets, relying on the net in net zero? There is a role, as we've seen, for removal, but in the first instance, we should look for companies to reduce their own emissions and the emissions in their supply chains. If they're genuine, credible commitments to do that, then a net zero commitment is a lot better than firms that just buy offsets to get themselves out of troubles.
I wonder if that might provide also a way into an answer to the next question I want to pull out. That's coming from Beth, Sam. And Beth asks, I hear a lot of net zero pledges, sometimes for 2030, sometimes 2040, sometimes 2050. Why are they different between countries and companies? And again, I would just add as a gloss on that, I suppose, in general sense, we're aware that some countries have developed faster than others. Some feel they have more to go in terms of economic growth and haven't had a fair shake at that. And also different companies can sometimes find themselves, I think, seeing where they can get a commercial advantage as well as one that is more about the kind of greater good. So what do those different dates mean? Is there something consistent between them?
I wouldn't read too much sort of substantive into the dates that they're signaling. What we want to achieve is net zero as fast as we can. So, if you can do it by 2040, do it by 2040. Don't wait until 2050. But what is often signaled is if I'm a UK company, the UK law says that the country as a whole will be net zero by 2050. So a net zero pledge by a company for 2050 basically signals, I am aware of the law of the land, I know what the country's rules are, and I'm going to abide by them. Can I go faster than that? That's the interesting question. And some companies can go faster just because their business models are such that they find it easier to reduce emissions. But again, those have to be genuine net zero pledges and not just, I'm going to buy a lot of offsets. So it's earlier is good, but earlier also has to be substantive rather than greenwashing.
Let's turn to a few questions that are very much about the here and now. This is, COP conversations, and we're all increasingly aware that the big meeting is happening in just a few weeks' time, and feeling perhaps a little apprehensive about how much has and has not been done behind the scenes to make it a success. But I guess we'll know that soon. But here are some of the questions that have come in, and I think a lot of people will be interested in the answers to these. First of all, from Erica L. Erica asks, is there going to be one big net zero agreement at COP26 like the Paris one? Or should, I suppose the corollary of that is, otherwise, should we expect really a kind of more of a mosaic or a matrix of different sorts of pledges and commitments coming together rather than one big bang like the Paris 2015 one?
Yeah, I mean, the Paris Agreement was exactly set up to be bottom up. There was an attempt earlier, the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, which tried to impose top-down commitments. The Paris Agreement is very much bottom up. Each country makes its own, what is called as nationally determined contributions. So each country decides what its fair share is towards that global goal of net zero by the middle of the century. So it is a patchwork of bottom up net zero, nationally determined contribution commitments. They're starting to add up. They don't add up to well below 2 degrees, but they're starting to bend the curve. The big emitters, China, the United States, the European Union, they have all committed to net zero. A lot of other countries have committed to net zero. That's very, very important. And you can call that the patchwork, but it's the design of the Paris Agreement. And we have to make sure that the patchwork, the bits of the patchwork add up to the right target. What I would say is once COP26 is out of the way, we will have to move from making those pledges to actually implementing them. What worries me much more at the moment is, are those pledges credible, rather than, have they got the net zero date exactly right? What we need is implementation now.
Well, could we press a little bit on something that's close to home in that case? I mean, those viewers, not all, but many who are based in the United Kingdom, where Oxford, of course, is as well, will have seen that the UK government has been making a great many pledges on net zero. And Sarah has actually sent in a question to ask, Professor, what do you think about the UK's new plans? And in general, do you want to name names and say which countries do you think are doing well or doing badly? And where does the UK sit on that spectrum?
Let me do the second part of the question first. Where does the UK sit? The UK is actually doing quite well. We looked at the G7 countries not so long ago and the emission reductions in the G7. And UK emissions have come fastest over the last 2 decades or so compared to the other G7 countries. UK emissions are down something like 42% over the past 20 years, I think it is. GDP is up by something like 70, 80%. If you do the math, that means the UK now needs 3 times less carbon to produce a unit of GDP than we did those 20, 30 years ago. So that's pretty good. If you then disentangle it, you find out that it's a combination of deliberate climate policy and just socioeconomic trends, deindustrialization, the dash for gas after energy liberalization. And if you split up those 42%, it's about 25% socioeconomics and 17% policy. So the UK is doing well, but not necessarily because the policies have been so good. And in a sense, that's a theme for the net zero strategy that was published earlier this week. It makes all the right noises. It recognizes what needs to be done, some good commitments on offshore wind, some good commitments on electric vehicles, on hydrogen. It probably doesn't add up to net zero by 2050. There will have to be more money, more innovation, more private investment. But it's a good start. It's the right sort of language. The worry again is, do we have a government that will implement what it says? And that's not a dig at the current government. That's a dig at every government we've had in the past.
Let's use that to take some questions that are now going to look to the future. And they're based on an optimistic assumption, but an assumption that somehow or other we do get to net zero. So let me combine a question from Jaya and a question from James C. They're essentially asking the same thing. Jaya asks, what happens when we get to, or after we get to net zero? And James is asking, what happens after net zero if we get there? What's the project for 2050 to 2100? In other words, the latter half of this century. Are we in a position to kind of model ahead, assuming that somehow or other we get to that goal?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, net zero is just a milestone. And if we, assuming we reach net zero by the middle of the century, the next sort of challenge will be to maintain, that net zero balance going forward. Just being net zero in 2050 and starting emitting again in 2051 is not the idea of the deal. So the idea is that you keep that balance going forward. Some people will say that we can start probably going negative. So starting to remove more carbon out of the atmosphere than we put in. A lot of those paths that give us the 1.5 to 2 degrees temperature target do involve an overshoot, and then you start removing emissions from the atmosphere again. The other thing I would say that we will have to do, not starting in 2050, but starting now, is we have to adapt. 1.5 to 2 degrees temperature change is a lot less painful than 3 or 4 degrees, which is absolutely scary, but it isn't without any implications. So we will have to adapt. We'll have to get used to the 1.5 to 2 degrees climate that we will live in. And that will also need a lot of planning, a lot of investment, and a lot of thinking.
Just on the back of that, I mean, I'm curious, Sam, because so much of the conversation, both around COP and around the wider decades-long issue, has been about technologies and what they can do. If it's possible to ask the question in this way. How much of our attention should we collectively as a species be thinking about what you just mentioned, which is adaptation, a reality that certain things are already probably over the tipping point and won't go back? And how much about technologies that can either mitigate or change? I mean, day to day we hear this about hydrogen fuel or that about heat pumps instead of boilers in homes in warm countries, or this about battery as opposed to fossil fuel powered transportation and vehicles. In a busy world, how can we balance these two elements and actually kind of work out where we feel that we need to be setting our sights, again, as individuals as much as members of society?
Let me split your question in two. I don't know whether that's what you intended, but the first balance is between, if you want to reduce emissions, what's the balance between technological fix and behavior change? And people who have sort of constructed emission reductions paths, you can look at those paths and then split it in technology fix and behavior change. And the answer is it's almost half-half. Technology fixes is probably about 40% of the answer. That's renewable energy, that's hydrogen, that's sustainable aviation fuels, things like that. But then behavior change is about 20-25% of the answer. That's eating less meat, flying less, putting the boiler down, the temperature down in the house, and so on. And then the rest is a combination of both, where behavior change and technology change comes together. Electric cars, for example, that's a technology fix, but they need behavior change in the way we approach mobility. That will be different. So it's a combination of the two. So if you add it up, it's about half-half. That's the split between behavior and technology if you want to reduce emissions. The other part of your question was, what's the balance between reducing emissions and avoiding the problem and adapting and sort of, dealing with the consequences of the problem? The answer is we need both. The emphasis has rightly been on reducing emissions. That's absolutely urgent, as we've seen. Emissions have to be cut in half within 10 years. But adaptation is also part of the mix, and we shouldn't think of adaptation as the way to avoid the emissions cuts. That's absolutely not what it is. It's just a necessary complement, because whatever we do, there will be a change and we have to adapt to it.
Sam, thank you very much. And that, I think, is a very fitting and, I think, thoughtful note on which to end this part of the conversation. I say this part of the conversation because, of course, climate change and the after effects of COP and the policies will be with us for a very long time to come. So we're immensely grateful to Sam for having spent some time today and having talked to us. And, of course, you can look up his books and articles and so forth if you want to find more. And we continue our COP conversations here on the Oxford University YouTube and other social media channels over the next couple of weeks. Next week, we are going to be talking to Professor Ros Rickaby, who will talk about, can we remove carbon from the atmosphere? That'll be a week today, Thursday, 28th of October, 12:45 p.m. British summer time. And don't forget that if you've missed any of our previous talks or would like to hear Sam again, you can find links to all previous talks via our webpage listed in the description just below the video. Great to have you all from around the world joining us today. Thank you again to Sam, and we hope that we'll see you again soon for another Oxford COP conversation.